At the end of the Second World War, Britain still looked like the center of a system so vast that maps had once painted it red by habit. London remained a clearinghouse for trade, insurance, shipping, and capital. Sterling still carried the old prestige of empire. The Bank of England still stood as one of the great nerve centers of global finance. British ministers still spoke in the language of world management, as if history itself had signed them to a permanent lease. Even exhausted, Britain was still responsible for feeding colonial territories, shipping coal into liberated Europe, and administering its zone in Germany. It had armies, diplomats, cables, bases, habits of command. It had the voice. It still knew how to sound like a superpower, and in some ways the performance was not entirely false. For more than a century, British power had fused finance, trade, naval reach, and political prestige into a single operating system. The empire's strength was not just territory. It was confidence. It was the assumption, held by allies and rivals alike, that when global rules needed writing, Britain would be in the room with a pen already uncapped. That assumption had survived wars, panics, and recessions. It had survived the rise of competitors. It had even survived the first cracks of the 20th century. But by 1945, the structure was carrying its own ghost. The facade remained imposing. The foundations were giving way. As one official history of the period puts it, the victorious Grand Alliance dissolved and left two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, with a bankrupt and exhausted United Kingdom in third place. Third place. For a power that had once measured distance in colonies and time in reigns, that was not just a ranking. It was a verdict. Empires do not usually fall in a single cinematic instant. They thin out. They mortgage tomorrow. They keep speaking in the future tense, while the accountants quietly repossess the present. And Britain's loss of economic supremacy did not begin with a battlefield defeat or a dramatic surrender. It began, as such things often do, in negotiations, balances, clauses, credit lines, and the slow humiliation of needing someone else's money to keep one's own system alive. Power was moving west across the Atlantic. Not symbolically, literally, into dollar reserves, into institutions, into the rules of trade, into the architecture of post-war finance. The strangest part is that much of it happened under the language of cooperation, reconstruction, and shared victory. That is how hegemony often arrives when it is dressed for polite company. There was one document in particular, one lifeline on paper, that seemed at first to promise recovery and continuity. Instead, it exposed just how completely the terms of power had changed. It was the Anglo-American financial agreement, signed in Washington in December 1945, a loan of $3.75 billion to Britain, repayable over 50 years. A rescue on the surface, a necessity in the judgment of most of the British government. But attached to that money were conditions. And inside those conditions sat one of the most dangerous words in imperial finance: convertibility. Sterling had long been more than a currency. It was a system of relationships, obligations, preferences, and delay. Convertibility sounded technical, almost harmless. In practice, it meant exposing Britain's fragile post-war position to the cold discipline of dollars. Why would a victorious empire, still draped across half the globe, accept terms that could force it to abandon imperial preference, open sterling, and edge toward what even some contemporaries recognized as client status? Why did the country that had once financed the world end up signing a document that would help explain why it no longer could? To answer that, the numbers have to be faced first, because the numbers tell the story long before the speeches do. They tell it with a kind of cruelty that rhetoric cannot soften. Britain entered the Second World War already burdened, with public debt at 135% of GDP. Then came total war. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility's long historical series, government spending rose to 62% of GDP in 1944-45, and about 80% of that spending was defense. Tax revenues rose too, all the way to 39% of GDP. It still was not enough. Borrowing did the rest, peaking at 27% of GDP in 1941-42. By the end of the war, Britain's debt stood at 249% of GDP, an all-time high. Not a bad year, not a difficult quarter, an all-time high. Those figures matter because they strip away the comforting mythology that Britain merely handed over leadership out of generosity, fatigue, or enlightened pragmatism. No, Britain was not calmly rearranging the furniture of world order. Britain was financially cornered. The physical cost of war had not fallen evenly across the alliance. The United States emerged enriched and industrially powerful. Britain did not. American industry had expanded massively. American territory had been untouched by invasion. American policymakers came out of the war with money, leverage, and a strong belief that the mistakes of the interwar period could not be repeated. In Washington, men like Cordell Hull and Harry Dexter White believed that high tariffs, discriminatory trade blocs, and competitive devaluations had poisoned the 1930s. They wanted a post-war order built around freer trade, fixed exchange rates, and institutions that would reduce the temptation of economic nationalism. Noble in theory, convenient in practice. The rules they proposed also happened to suit the country with the strongest currency, the deepest industrial base, and the largest share of power. Britain, meanwhile, had been operating on borrowed endurance. Wartime lend-lease had supplied essential support. But, as the official British diplomatic history notes, the abrupt cutoff of lend-lease after VJ Day in August 1945 shocked the new Labour government. Suddenly, the country faced expensive domestic promises at home and heavy global commitments abroad with no easy bridge between wartime solidarity and peacetime solvency. John Maynard Keynes, leading the British negotiating team, had been warning since March 1945 of a financial Dunkirk. The phrase was not melodrama, it was diagnosis. During the loan negotiations, Britain estimated its 1946 balance of payments deficit at £750 million, to be followed by another £500 million in both 1947 and 1948. At the end of 1945, Britain's gold and dollar reserves stood at nearly $2.25 billion. Add the proposed American credit of $3.75 billion and the subsequent Canadian credit of $1.25 billion, and total resources reached about $7.25 billion. That sounds large until the rest of the page is read. By the British Embassy's own memorandum to the U.S. State Department in 1947, the monthly net drain on reserves and credits accelerated ominously, $31 million a month in the first quarter of 1946, $82 million in the second, $70 million in the third, $123 million in the fourth, then $137 million in January 1947, $224 million in February, $323 million in March, $307 million in April, and $334 million in May. That is the kind of sequence that turns abstract anxiety into institutional panic. A country can survive a shortage. It cannot easily survive acceleration. The same memorandum laid out the deeper trap. World prices had risen sharply. The rise in prices was costing Britain $60 to $70 million a month. A 40% increase in the U.S. wholesale price index since the loan negotiations meant, in Britain's own words, that the buying power of the American credit was effectively about $1 billion, less than when the deal had been struck. The forecasts behind the loan had assumed sterling prices at roughly double pre-war levels. In reality, import prices were now over 250% of 1938, while export prices were only about 220% of 1938. Britain was paying more for what it needed than it could reliably earn from what it sold. That is not just inflation. That is strategic suffocation. By the end of June 1947, Britain expected to have gold and dollar resources of about $2.4 billion, with $1.7 billion left undrawn from the U.S. credit and $570 million from the Canadian credit, for a total of roughly $4.7 billion. But even that was misleading because officials regarded $1 billion as a final reserve, a war chest, and said that a further $1 billion was essential. In other words, much of what remained was not truly spendable without inviting something close to national financial breakdown. And this was happening while Britain was still trying to behave like Britain. It still had overseas military commitments. It still had imperial obligations. It still had political ambitions, spanning Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and beyond. The bill belonged to a medium-sized, exhausted economy. The posture belonged to a world manager. Those two facts could coexist for a while. They could not coexist forever. This is where the institutions enter, because America did not replace Britain simply by being richer. Plenty of states have become rich without becoming systemic rulers. The United States did something more durable. It wrote rules. At Bretton Woods in July 1944, delegates from 44 nations agreed to create the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank. The IMF would oversee a system of fixed exchange rates centered on the US dollar and gold, while also providing short-term financial assistance to countries with temporary balance of payments problems. Later, in Geneva in 1947, 23 nations signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, cutting tariffs and imperial preferences and creating an interim framework for post-war commercial relations. This was not merely policy, it was constitutional engineering for the global economy. Britain was present at this creation. But presence is not ownership. Keynes came to these negotiations as the most famous economist in the world, a man whose intellect could command a room before he spoke. Yet fame is not leverage either, not when the other side has the money. Keynes himself embodied the long arc of Britain's rise and fall more cleanly than perhaps any statesman of the era. He was not merely an economist in a textbook. He was an English economist, journalist, and financier, the son of John Neville Keynes and a veteran of the British Treasury during the First World War. He had attended the Versailles Peace Conference and had seen, up close, how punitive financial settlements and grand political illusions could poison an entire generation. He knew that numbers were never just numbers. They were translated politics. They became unemployment, extremism, humiliation, and instability. That experience marked him. By 1945, he was also physically diminished, a brilliant mind negotiating against time as much as against Washington. There is something almost painfully symbolic about that final mission. The most celebrated British economist of the age, carrying the intellectual confidence of a still imperial country, arriving in America not to design victory from a position of command, but to plead, bargain, and salvage. He wanted a grant in aid, or at least an interest-free loan, something that could be presented as justice in recognition of Britain's wartime sacrifices. He was not naive about American interests, but he still hoped that alliance, sacrifice, and strategic necessity would count for more than pure commercial arithmetic. In a sense, Keynes represented the last great British attempt to persuade the New World Order to behave like the old one, only kinder. He was asking for room, for patience, for recognition that Britain's wounds were part of a common Allied story. Washington was already speaking a different language. It spoke in conditions, incentives, anti-discrimination clauses, and access. The Americans offered borrowing with interest. They also wanted what the British source bluntly calls sweeteners, extended leases on military bases in British territory, and preferential access for U.S. corporations to civil aviation routes and telecommunications networks. Even the rescue had acquisition features. What happened in those rooms was not a melodrama of villains and martyrs. It was more chilling than that. It was the negotiation scene that appears whenever power changes hands between allies. Everyone smiles. Everyone references shared principles. Everyone knows the weaker side has fewer choices than it pretends. The British government was divided. Some ministers and officials opposed the deal because its attached conditions required radical changes to British commercial arrangements. Others thought refusal might force the Americans to improve the offer. Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary, pressed hardest for acceptance, not only for financial reasons, but geopolitical ones. He believed the agreement was essential to preserve Britain's role as a bridge between East and West, revive trade with Europe, and above all, remain close to the United States. That calculation was realistic. It was also revealing. Britain was no longer trying to dominate the new order. It was trying to secure a good seat inside it. Keynes defended the agreement in the House of Lords with a line as dignified as it was bleak. Our American friends were interested not in our wounds, but in our convalescence. They wanted to be told that we intended to walk without bandages as soon as possible. That is one of those sentences that sounds polite until you listen closely. The Americans were not being asked to admire Britain's sacrifice. They were demanding proof that Britain could recover on terms that suited the post-war system America intended to lead. No bandages, no imperial preferences, no special dispensation forever. Running beside this British drama was another story, one that at first glance looked almost academic. It concerned an American Treasury official named Harry Dexter White. He lacked Keynes's celebrity. He did not arrive trailing an international aura of genius. But in the architecture of post-war power, White mattered immensely. The U.S. State Department's history records that by early 1942, White, as special assistant to the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, had drafted plans for institutions that would stabilize exchange rates and provide assistance to countries with short-term deficits, so they would not resort to protectionist or predatory policies. In IMF historian James Botton's account, White was one of the two great intellectual founders of the IMF and the World Bank. This matters because White's project was not just about helping countries through temporary difficulty. It was about building a world in which American preferences became normal procedure. Fixed exchange rates centered on the dollar and gold. Reduced trade discrimination. Pressure against closed blocks. International consultation under institutions created at a moment of unmatched American strength. In such a world, the country that issued the central currency would hold a kind of advantage Britain had once enjoyed through sterling, only on a far larger industrial base, and with far fewer illusions about sharing control. At first, these two stories could seem separate. Britain scrambling for liquidity, America designing institutions. One looked like emergency management. The other looked like statesmanship. In reality, they were converging toward the same point. Britain's weakness made it more dependent on the very system America was building. And that system was being built in a way that made Britain's older imperial economic habits harder to sustain. The contradiction at the center of the story now comes into full view. The United States had helped save Britain during the war. But it also insisted, in the Atlantic Charter and in Article 7 of the 1942 Lend-Lease Agreement, on principles that pushed against discriminatory trade practices and preferential blocks. American leaders believed freer trade would support peace and prosperity. They also disliked imperial preference on both ideological and practical grounds. Britain and Canada were America's two largest trading partners. A closed imperial system was not merely philosophically unattractive. It was commercially inconvenient, so the ally that financed Britain's survival was also pressing Britain to dismantle parts of the imperial framework that had helped sustain British power. Cooperation and displacement were happening at once. Assistance was real. Self-interest was real too. These are not mutually exclusive categories in foreign policy. Often they are the same category wearing different language. This is why the word convertibility matters so much. Requiring sterling to be convertible into dollars was not just a technical reform. It challenged the logic of Britain's post-war position. Around the sterling area sat countries and territories holding sterling balances, claims accumulated in London during the war. Before the war, sterling balances held in London by foreign countries had ranged between roughly £0.5 and £1 billion. After the war, the pressure was far greater, and the broader world dollar shortage meant countries short of dollars had every incentive to convert whatever sterling they could into the American currency that actually bought things. The old prestige of sterling now met the new supremacy of the dollar in the most unforgiving way possible, as a choice made by people who preferred liquidity over sentiment. That is the twist that recontextualizes the entire narrative. Britain was not simply poor. Britain was trapped between two incompatible promises. It promised voters a radical domestic expansion of the state after the war. It promised international partners that sterling still meant something. It promised imperial and geopolitical reach beyond what its balance sheet could easily bear. And it accepted American terms built for a world in which monetary credibility would be measured less by history than by reserves. Too many promises. Too few dollars. Even Bevan's broader geopolitical logic had a tragic undertone. He wanted Britain close to America because he understood that the Soviet Union and the United States were becoming the dominant poles of the new era. He feared the consequences of being isolated between them. In that sense, acceptance of the loan was sensible, perhaps unavoidable. But precisely because it was unavoidable, it marked the altered hierarchy. Britain no longer had the luxury of choosing its grand strategy without first checking whether the reserves could survive the month. The aftermath was not an overnight imperial funeral. History is seldom that neat. Britain did not cease to matter in 1945, or 1947, or any single year. It remained influential, nuclear eventually, diplomatically formidable, culturally significant, financially inventive. London did not vanish, but the economic center of gravity had moved. The downstream consequences would be measured in decades. The immediate costs were harsh enough. Britain entered the post-war years with debt close to 250% of GDP and borrowing at 6% of GDP in 1946 to 47. The state expanded even as defense spending fell, with public spending rising from 27% of GDP in the 10 years before the war to 42% in the decade after 1945. The welfare state could be built, yes, but only within a country carrying one of the heaviest debt burdens in its history. Choices had to be sequenced. Commitments had to be rationed. Prestige had to be quietly edited. Abroad, the loss of economic primacy weakened every imperial reflex. A global position built partly on financial elasticity becomes very difficult to maintain when every overseas commitment is also a drain on scarce hard currency. Bases, troop deployments, reconstruction obligations, food imports, strategic posturing across multiple theaters, all of it becomes more expensive when the central reserve currency is no longer yours. Britain could still project influence, but it did so increasingly within a US-shaped framework, and often with American support, tolerance, or financing somewhere in the background. That is not equality. That is adjustment. Meanwhile, the institutional order America helped create proved remarkably durable. The fixed exchange rate system established at Bretton Woods would endure for much of 3 decades. The dollar sat at the center. The IMF and World Bank existed. GATT governed trade relations for almost 50 years before the World Trade Organization replaced it. These were not passing arrangements improvised in the rubble. They were pillars. America was not just stronger than Britain. America had become systemically necessary in a way Britain no longer was. And there is one final indignity that captures the long tail of the transfer. The British government's final payments on the American and Canadian loans agreed in the aftermath of the war were not made until December 2006. Think about that. The conflict ended in 1945. The bill lasted into the 21st century. Entire political generations were born, governed, retired, and died before the tab was settled. The empire that once financed wars across continents spent decades paying off the terms of its own rescue. History has a taste for irony. Dry, almost administrative irony. Still, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point at which popular history sometimes slips into tabloid certainty. It is tempting to tell the story as a simple conspiracy in which America deliberately bankrupted Britain, seized the throne, and wrote the rules to its own selfish design while Britain sleepwalked into ruin. That version is too easy. And easy stories are usually hiding something. Britain's decline had deeper roots than one loan agreement or one American negotiating strategy. The country had entered the war already heavily indebted. 2 world wars transformed its fiscal structure. The costs of total war were immense. Anti-colonial pressures were rising. Europe was devastated. The global economy needed a workable monetary order after the catastrophes of the interwar period. American policymakers were not wrong to fear a return to tariff wars, discriminatory blocs, and beggar-thy-neighbor devaluations. The United States also did provide real help, and as Keynes himself acknowledged, much more help would later be needed not just for Britain, but for Western Europe, At the same time, Britain was not an innocent bystander dragged from history's stage by strangers. British leaders made choices. They defended commitments they could no longer afford. They hoped status might outlast solvency. They entered negotiations with limited leverage and discovered painfully that prestige cannot be deposited at the Bank of England. It can only be spent after the dollars arrive. So the replacement of Britain by America as the world's economic superpower was neither a clean handover nor a single betrayal. It was a structural transition accelerated by war, ratified by debt, institutionalized by Bretton Woods, and revealed by the inability of sterling to perform the role it once claimed by right of habit. That is a more complicated story. It is also the more unsettling one, because the real lesson is not just about Britain and America. It is about power itself. Great powers usually imagine their supremacy in terms of flags, fleets, speeches, and maps. But the deeper test comes later, in the invisible mechanisms that decide what promises can actually be funded, what alliances can be maintained without strain, what rules other countries accept as normal, and which currency the world reaches for when it is frightened. The state that supplies that currency and writes those rules possesses a form of authority more pervasive than pageantry. It governs the weather of the system. Britain learned, in the hardest possible way, that there is a difference between looking central and being indispensable. The two can overlap for years, then one day they don't. Then the letters become loans, the loans become conditions, the conditions become institutions, and the institutions become common sense. By the time the transfer is obvious to everyone, it is already old news to the accountants, and perhaps that is the most timeless part of the story. Power rarely dies when its enemies say it should. It dies when its balance sheet begins to contradict its mythology, when a nation's image of itself becomes more expensive than its reserves can bear, when it must accept rescue from the very system that will outgrow it, not with a bang, with a signature. If one word captures that transformation, it is not empire, and it is not even decline. It is convertibility, the moment when prestige had to face redemption in harder currency. If you want to leave a mark below, write that word in the comments, convertibility. And if this is the kind of history you come here for, not the comforting version, but the audited one, then stay with the channel. There are more ledgers to open, and most of them are darker than they first appear.